Closed captioning of this program is made possible by the Fireman's Fund Foundation.
What's at stake for health care reform in California as the U.S. Supreme Court considers the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act next week? The California State University system says that it will not accept any new students next spring. Sheriff Ross Mirkarimi has been suspended but says that he won't step down despite San Francisco Mayor Ed Lee's decision to file misconduct charges against him. And our state parks may be on the rocks, but some are managing to stay open in spite of budget cuts. Coming up next. Good evening, I'm Belva Davis, and welcome to This Week in Northern California. Joining me on our news panel tonight are Rachel Myrow, host and reporter of the California Report on KQED Public Radio, and Rachel Gordon, San Francisco Chronicle City Hall reporter, and Nanette Asma, San Francisco Chronicle reporter, and David Lazarus, Los Angeles Times and KTLA business columnist, joining us from Los Angeles tonight. David, we're glad to have you back on the show. Haven't seen you for quite a while. Tell us
It's been too long.
why the Supreme Court is going to take so much time to hear this case. That's the one of the most unusual things about it. Is that not true?
And you're right about that, Belva. Normally, there's just a handful of, a half hour here, a half hour there of argument. We haven't really seen longer amounts of argument for a case. Brown versus Board of Education had more time. Financial reform had more time. The Miranda rights had more time. And now we have this, which really underlines the monumental nature of the healthcare reform decisions that are afoot. And there's 3 days that are set. And for everyone playing along at home, the first day is going to tackle basic questions of should the court even be considering this now, or should they put it off until 2015 after the exchanges and the mandate kick in? That's the first day. The second day actually tackles the mandate, so-called guaranteed issue, whether people should have to get health insurance or pay some sort of tax penalty. And then on the third day, they'll tackle the question of if the mandate is unconstitutional, should the rest of the entire healthcare reform law fall apart as well? So you've got these 3 days that are all lined up for this, but the heart really is the question of guaranteed issue. And very quickly, let's look at what this is. Part of the Healthcare Reform Act says that insurers, as of 2014, cannot turn anybody away regardless of their medical condition. So those so-called pre-existing conditions, they have no meaning anymore. But, and here's a little bit of Econ 101 for everybody, if people just wait until they get sick before getting insurance, rates are going to go through the roof because, well, this is just not how insurance works. Insurance is a spreading out of risk, meaning you have to have healthy people and unhealthy people. So without some sort of mechanism to get healthy people into the risk pool as well, it falls apart. And that's what the mandate is intended to address, is on the one hand, they have to give insurance to everybody. On the other hand, we get everybody into the risk pool. And the question here is, does Congress have the authority to enact this? The Obama administration says yes, under 2 elements of the Constitution: Congress's ability to regulate commerce and do whatever is quote unquote necessary and proper to do so, and Congress's ability to regulate taxation issues. Now, the other side says no. I'm sorry?
No, I was just going to have you pause right there. I want to know what the other side has to say.
Yeah, and very quickly, the other side basically says Congress is overreaching here, that there is no precedent for Congress to go this far in terms of requiring somebody to buy a product. And that's really where the lines are.
But David, we're looking at the policy issue of it. We're really also looking at the politics of it with the November election coming up for the presidential race. This has been really one of the cornerstones of the Obama administration for the domestic policy, at least. We've also got Republican candidate Mitt Romney, who had his Romney Care in Massachusetts, who now is backpedaling from that a little bit because the conservatives don't like the mandates. How's this playing out, the timing with the Supreme Court? Do you think that's going to be taken into consideration as well?
It's hard to think that it won't be, and yet in terms of some historical perspective here, since the New Deal, the Supreme Court has essentially deferred to Congress on all of its lawmaking capabilities and has stepped back primarily and said, we acknowledge that this is the legislators' jurisdiction, that they enact laws, they regulate laws, they do that, and that the role of the Supreme Court is not to step in and step on their toes. Now, there was some of that during the New Deal where the Supreme Court tried to back away from some of it and then they changed their course, but since then there hasn't been a lot of really impetus on the part of the justices to want to meddle in this sort of thing, but we have seen a whole lot of changes in recent years. Citizens United, the one that allowed all of that money spilling into super PACs, really kind of suggests that these justices are not shy about going for a decision that will have clear political implications. Beyond that, though, it's kind of a coin toss as to where the various justices would vote.
David, can they be fair? Hasn't the wife, for example, of one of the justices, Clarence Thomas, been campaigning against, can we call it Obamacare? And is that something that will make Clarence Thomas have to recuse himself?
Well, there's been a lot of discussion about that. And also Sonia Sotomayor, who, when she was Solicitor General for the White House, also handled health care things. And there's been talk that she should also recuse herself. Both of them have sort of taken the high ground here and said, hey, dudes, we are Supreme Court justices. I don't think they use dudes, but they said we're Supreme Court justices and we're above that kind of thing. We can vote fairly. And there really hasn't been any kind of agitation on the part of the other justices. And it would really take that kind of peer group pressure to get them to recuse themselves. In fact, Chief Justice John Roberts has pretty much come out and said he feels that both Sotomayor and Thomas are well suited to consider this case.
David, given that Medicaid has been around since the 1960s and that the federal government has been issuing all sorts of edicts to the states over these many years, what's your sense about why the U.S. Supreme Court has decided to weigh in on whether or not Congress has the right, the federal government has the right to issue an edict, in this case, mandating elements of the Affordable Care Act?
You know, they really didn't have a choice because we saw lower courts having mixed decisions coming up. Some of them said that the mandate is constitutional. Some of them said no. It was clear that somebody was going to have to step in and make a final call. Now, they could still punt. Like I said, the first day is devoted to whether they should put off a decision until after the mandate actually kicks in 2014. The betting line out there is that the justices won't. They know that this is a very closely watched issue. They know it's a very political issue. And neither side is calling for them to put it off. Both the Obama administration and the opponents to the health care reform law, both are saying, we want a decision on this now. So I think the justices are going to step up, find their spine, and do this. I think the real issue here is it going to be between the typical conservative wing and the progressive wing, with probably Justice Kennedy as the swing vote? Or can we expect to see Scalia, for example, a very conservative voice, but someone who in the past has deferred to Congress on matters of Congress? Well, I think it's going to be interesting to see how they go.
Well, you know, you can follow this story on KQED's ongoing coverage of the Supreme Court hearings on health care reform at kqed.org/thisweek. David, stay with us. We're going to move on now to Nanette, and with the story being that the California State University system is almost like shutting down for new students.
Well, next spring in 2013, that is correct. The California State University has decided not to accept any new transfer students for next. This is going to affect about 16,000 students. So it has been a bad week for California State University. I would say about the only thing you can say that's been good is that they haven't raised tuition last week. So the next problem that could drop is that the state university trustees are threatening that if California voters do not approve a tax measure on the next November ballot, which has not even qualified for the ballot yet, that another 25,000 students could actually be barred from entering. These are qualified students and they won't be able to go in.
So, I mean, this seems dramatic, perhaps draconian, and it seems unprecedented, right? I mean, if they ever said we're shutting down the university to new admissions, and is it really the threat out there to get people to start thinking about this tax hike?
This is actually a technique, closing spring admissions. They did it, I believe, in 2010. But their point is, if we don't have the money to run the university, if we're not, they were cut $750 million this fiscal year alone. So you can either raise tuition or you can cut access, and they're tired of raising tuition. In fact, you could say that this is an interesting way for them to avoid more student protests, because whenever they raise student tuition, we know what happens. Students storm onto the campus, and they're not going to do that. It's unlikely that they'll do that when community college students are simply not going to be able to enter. That's not something that will necessarily trigger a protest. So what happens
to these community college students then?
That's a great question, because there's no room in the community colleges. So they're going to be stuck there for at least another semester trying to get in. And then if the tax measure doesn't pass, and that is definitely something that State University wants, is that tax measure to pass. So then there'll be more students out on the street.
David, this is a very hot topic of conversation here, because where we are, you see Berkeley, place known for its activism. Well, how big is this in LA?
Oh, it's huge here. Cal State runs the gamut throughout the entire state, and there's been a lot of conversation about essentially mortgaging our future as we deny good quality higher education to students. But what I have to wonder, Nanette, is how much are Cal State administrators playing chicken, not just with lawmakers, but also with taxpayers and voters, essentially holding a gun to our heads and saying, if you don't give us the money we want, we're not going to educate your kids.
Well, that is true, but what happens is that the state university or the state subsidizes in-state tuition. So they are going to cut students from the rolls. They're going to lay off teachers. What happens, they say, as the Governor Brown is saying too, if the tax measure does not pass, then another $200 million will be cut from the budget. So, that's just evidently a fact. And what many students want is for the trustees to pony up money themselves. They are targeting the very wealthy trustees and saying, it's your job to find other ways, besides cutting students, besides raising tuition, to find other ways to give us money. And that's just, apparently, it's a fact.
Now, Nanette, from what I understand, this isn't rolling down the same way across all 23 campuses in the system. 8 of the campuses, including Cal State LA, including San Francisco State, it's happening a little bit different. They're letting in some students, but not as many as we might like.
That is true. So about 500 students, I think you could call it a drop in the bucket, are part of a new transfer program that the legislature is really hoping is going to grow to encourage more transfer. So you've got this double thing going on. You've got a state that is passing laws to try and encourage transfers, and then you've got California State University slamming the door. So a trickle of students will be permitted at 8 campuses.
And we're also having it across campuses, right, that students cannot get classes anyway. So if they are lucky enough to be admitted to the university and they have a major in something like nursing, for example, they can't get classes they need to graduate, so they're there more than 4 years, maybe 5 years or 6 years now, right?
Totally impacted, that's right, and students are waiting. I've gone over to the campuses so many times and seen students just, pouring out the door, begging professors to let them in, but there's no room.
Well, we're going to move now to a story that doesn't have to do with the state budget, but it is a long-running story here. Rachel Gordon, you have that story of what is happening with the suspended sheriff, Mr. Ross Mirkarimi.
So this was something that happens very rarely in San Francisco, and that's one citywide elected official, Mayor Ed Lee, decided to suspend another one, Sheriff Ross Mirkarimi, who was sworn into office on January 8th. Ed Lee said that since the sheriff has pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor count of false imprisonment of his wife, that he should no longer serve as sheriff, that he doesn't have the moral authority to, and legally it puts him on shaky ground. Now, Mirkarimi said, I am fighting this. I'm not going to go quietly. The mayor gave him 24 hours, in fact, to resign and kind of spare the city of any of this tumult. Ross said, nope, I'm not going to do it. First, it goes to the city's Independent Ethics Commission. Then it goes to the Board of Supervisors, which would ultimately decide whether the sheriff must be removed or whether he can stay in office. He's got more than 3 years left on his term. And ultimately, Mirkarimi, if he is ousted by the Board of Supervisors, many of them his old colleagues, he can go to the court and try to fight it there. So it's something that's happened very rarely in San Francisco. It's a case that really broke at the beginning of the new year, and it just keeps having one new development after another.
How does he hope to run a department without any friends.
Right. Well, right now he's not running a department. In fact, as the mayor suspended him, he also put in a woman named Vicki Hennessy, not related to the old sheriff Mike Hennessy. Hennessy's a retired, long-term career sheriff's department uniformed official. She came back from retirement to run the department on an interim basis. So it is kind of steady at the helm, I guess you could say. Mirkarimi, though, thinks that he can come back in. The people of San Francisco elected him. He says if anyone's going to oust him, it needs to be the people of San Francisco. Now, a recall drive could begin July 8th. That's a 6-month mark when he came into office. Or they could wait till his next term. The city's been forgiving in the past to politicians who have kind of fallen. This seems to be a little bit different because it's related to a domestic violence charge that the district attorney initially charged him with
David has
in
a
January.
question for you.
David.
What are they talking about?
And the question. Well, from down here, we've actually been running stories in the Times that kind of makes this whole thing look like a soap opera. But I'm kind of wondering about what grounds Mirkarimi has to fight this thing, because San Francisco's city charter has its code of misconduct, and it's a kind of a catch-all that if you don't meet a standard of decency, as it says, you're out on your keister. Well, okay, so that seems like a catch-all. What do the lawyers say about whether Mirkarimi can get over that?
Well, the city attorney says that he doesn't stand a chance, that he really is guilty of official misconduct. Mirkarimi's attorneys, who have not quite heard from this week, though, think that he has a chance to fight this. It's a very broad law in San Francisco that, in fact, was enacted in 1995 and has really never been fully tested through the process in the city. The last time an official went through this was Ed Ju from the Board of Supervisors, and he decided to resign before it got to the point of the Ethics Commissioner and the Board of Supervisors making a decision. He was sent to federal prison for not living in San Francisco and from taking bribes from people for city favors. The last time an official was actually really ousted by the process of official misconduct was in 1932 when it was a public defender who was caught up in a murder for hire scheme. It was also tested in the 1970s when George Moscone was mayor, when an airports commissioner was removed by the Board of Supervisors, but he had that decision overturned by a court. So in our long, long history in San Francisco, it's something that's not been tried very often.
Rachel, looking at the choices, though, what could Mirkarimi do if he decided to step down? I mean,
so that goes into Rachel's
yes.
Rachel's question as well. What has he done? He's been a political person for a long time. He was also he's a peace officer certified by the state because he was an investigator in the district attorney's office. Well, it might be difficult for him to get a job in that field. You know, there are jobs for politicians. If he did have friends that could find somewhere. Willie Brown, our former mayor of San Francisco, always seemed to take care of people when he was in the state legislature. But he's in a really difficult position. We're seeing a lot of the people who have been friends of his, at least political allies, falling away. Most notably, really, is Aaron Peskin, who chairs the local Democratic Party in San Francisco, was his colleague when he was on the Board of Supervisors. And Peskin said, it's time for you to leave. Peter Keene, who used to be in the public defender's office, who's now at Golden Gate University Law School, he's saying it's time for him to step down. But I've been interviewing people this week who say, look, the guy deserves a chance. He deserves a chance, number one, to show that it's not misconduct, if that's what he truly is pushing for, if it's going to be through the political process at City Hall or if it's going to be in the courts. One of the big questions, though, he was suspended without pay. Is that something that at least his lawyers could challenge that on a due process grounds?
At the very least, he's got screenplay rights to sell.
That's right.
And that's where it'll move down south when they decide to do this as a reality show.
Hopefully they'll shoot it here in San Francisco.
Right. Well, this month, KQED's California Report presents On the Rocks, an in-depth series looking at how 70 of California's 278 state parks are facing closure due to budget cuts and the creative rescue plans underway to keep some of them open. Rachel Morrow tells us some of your findings as you have put together the series about this.
Well, Belva, I'm sorry to tell you that state budget cuts come back into play, and that's very much the case here. The last 2 fiscal years, the Parks Department is looking at having to cut the budget by $22 million. And this comes on top of about 30 years of underfunding. There's a huge backlog of repairs. Many of the state's best parks, beautiful parks, run on essentially banker's hours. You have to call ahead to make sure there's going to be somebody there to take your $7 for the parking fee. You know, it's anyone's bet whether there's going to be toilet paper in the bathrooms. At this point, with the latest budget cut roll down, the Parks Department issued a list last July of 70 parks. They said, you know, we're just going to close these down. This has put a lot of volunteer groups on notice. There are lots of nonprofits attached to each of these parks. Californians love their parks, their beaches, their historic sites, and so many people have rallied. They've taken out their checkbooks. Local governments have rallied. Even the federal government has come into play, and they've managed to take about 10 parks off the list. So now it's 60 parks set to close, and a couple dozen other groups still in negotiations trying to whittle down that list.
How do you close a park? I mean, can't people just walk right in and bring their dogs and enjoy it?
Yes, they can.
Padlock that park.
You can't padlock a park. You can't padlock beaches for sure. They've pretty much had to back away from closing beaches. I believe there are coastal laws that come into play there. So then you have this big question. Drunken teenagers, arsonists, you know, mafia groups growing pot. Who's checking? Who's, you know, keeping a watch on these parks? And it kind of falls back on local sheriff's departments.
So, Rachel, let me ask you about the public-private partnerships that are kind of emerging now in this thing. What does that mean in terms of these are the people's parks, they're public parks? Does that mean that it's private groups that are controlling it, the rules, so they have special access, or is it a partnership where, okay, we'll give you the money, the Parks Department for the state, for the people, run by the people, still get control, and they're still the people's parks?
Well, no private group has come forward and said, we want to claim this park, we'll buy it from you. And that's certainly not what the Parks Agency is offering. We talked to the head of the department, Ruth Coleman, who basically said, no, we're maintaining control of and responsibility for the parks. Many of the private companies involved tend to run certain concessions or campgrounds. That's what they do, campgrounds at one or more parks around the state. So that's sort of where they come into play. Now you have a lot of people like Assemblyman Jared Huffman of San Rafael saying, you know, isn't there some way the parks could do a better job, maybe take a page from private companies of better revenue generation? If people knew that by paying $14 instead of $7 for that parking spot, they could help keep a park open or keep it open for longer hours, I think a lot of Californians might step forward.
David, we often hear about famous people, especially from Southern California, who come to the rescue of all sorts of causes. Has this risen to that level in Southern California, this fear of having these parks closed?
It doesn't really seem that way. Of all the various cause célèbres that are around, this isn't one that rises there. But I have a question for Rachel, and that is, you raise the specter of arsonists, vandals, drunks getting into the closed parks. Wouldn't it make sense to just throw them open, even though they are untended, even though they are unsupervised, and allow the public to still maintain a sort of quasi-custodial role over them so that at least someone is looking after this territory?
Well, I should say, as we've mentioned before, the parks aren't actually padlocked, so you can go in. You can go in many cases with your dog, with your friends, and volunteers, people who love their parks, are often keeping a watchful eye as it is now. So but you have to ask yourself. In one of the stories, I did a profile of Henry Copark. Many of the volunteers, totally dedicated, many of them elderly. What are they going to go up with some kind of a whistle, a dog whistle, and say to an arsonist, you there, you stop that right now? It's just not something that can happen. For that, you really want somebody who's a law enforcement officer who carries the weight of the government behind him or her saying, you stop that right now.
I guess also that if we're not maintaining the parks, the longer we don't maintain them, the more costly it's going to be to get them back in shape if we ever have money or the will later on to do it. And, I mean, are people talking about that, looking at the short term versus the long term?
But as in the case of so many things involving the state budget cuts, the short-term budget savings are oftentimes taking the lead, even though lawmakers know, even though state bureaucrats know that you know, you're saving a dime and losing $1 in the long run.
So where do we go from here in terms of thinking about the parks as to who? We always look for someone to blame for something. So we have the budget. do people think that the governor ought to be able to do something better than the move that he made in deeming these 70 parks?
Well, there are some people who feel that, not unlike with the CSU system, that what's happening here is a game of chicken with the voters. You want your state parks? You better give us some more revenue, because that's the only way it's going to happen. That seems to be the message coming from Governor Jerry Brown.
2 years ago, I believe.
Yeah, they've refused in the past, but this is pretty draconian. Now, under the Schwarzenegger administration, they suggested closing parks as well, but this is the first time it looks like it's actually going to happen. And maybe given that situation of extremity, people might change the way they behave.
And we want to note that beautiful footage of the parks was provided by California Forever, a two-part documentary celebrating the legacy of California state parks and the importance of their preservation, airing in the fall on PBS and presented by KQED. Well, that's all the time we have. We want to thank you all for joining us, and especially you, David, for joining us from Los Angeles, and hope you'll do it often. Visit kqed.org/thisweek for more information about California Forever on the Rocks and for KQED's coverage of the Supreme Court hearings on healthcare reform. You can also view past episodes and segments and subscribe to our newsletter and our podcasts. I'm Belva Davis. Thank you for watching. Good night.